I will not be chairing the meeting, but I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about the webinar series. Actually, this webinar is part of a series of 4 or 5 events that are organized by the network Sociologies of Education, which many of you know, I think, as Network 28 within the European Education Research Association. It's a network of sociologists which was established about a decade ago with a view to reflecting a bit specifically on the evolution of sociology of education. And the network is currently run by Esther Neumann, who could not be here today. So that's why she asked me to introduce the event in the name of the network. So again, I would like to welcome everyone. We are very much hoping not to have any technical problem during the session. There is a very, very large number of participants, more than 400 people registered to the event. So hopefully everything will go smoothly. Before starting, I just would like to remind you or to inform you about 2 upcoming webinars of the network. On the 16th of May at 2 p.m., we will have a talk by Carrie Facer, presenting a paper titled Possibility and the Temporal Imagination. A couple of weeks later, on the 6th of June in the morning, this time at 10 a.m., Rachel Brooke will give a talk titled Higher Education Timescapes, Temporal Understandings of Students and Learning. I will put the registration links in the chat for those interested. I should also inform you that the current session will be recorded, but it will not be fully recorded. So we will be recording the presentation by our keynote speaker, Gert Biesta, but we will not be recording the discussion that will follow, okay? So I think the recording just started, and it will end at the end of the presentation before the discussion. Okay, I just remind you to turn off your microphone because we still hear some people, I think, in the background. And I will now give the floor to Jitka Witrova, who will be introducing our speaker and chairing the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much, Professor Biesta, for being here with us. Also, thank you all the participants. The number is still rising, so I hope the talk will be really, really interesting and superlative. Thank you again, and I would like to introduce Professor Gert Biesta, who is a professor of educational theory and pedagogy at the Moray House School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh, and a professor of public education at Maynooth University, Ireland. He is also a member of the Educational Council of Netherlands, the advisory body of the Dutch government and parliament, co-editor of Asia Pacific Journal of Teacher Education, and associate editor of educational theory. His most recent monography, World-Centered Education, A View for the Present, was published in 2021 by Routledge. Nevertheless, I would like to introduce Professor Biesta not only in this usual way of listing all his affiliations and positions. Also, I would like to recall a few fragments from his reflection on education to show how the radical character is of his thought. Just let's start with current events. While the predominant character of expertise in education now is managerial and administrative, Professor Biesta engaged in philosophy, which makes him able to comment on salient topics and problems from really radical point of view. This means it means shedding light on the roots of problems. Let's recall, for example, his paper on critical thinking and question of critique from the turn of the millennium, which was co-authored with Professor Stems in 2001, in which they put ideas from Kant to Derrida to work for today's questions of the critical potential of education, of educational theory and practice. Professor Biesta reminds us that not only technocratic culture exists in education, but also specific pedagogical and educational thinking is needed, which is beginning to be in minority, at least from my Central European perspective, where pedagogy as a specific scholarship loses its voice in favor of managerial languages. In a similar radical way, in my view, he shows that we should rather ask about what kind of society the school needs in his paper from 2019, instead of asking how education should answer to a quickly changing world in many mutations we all know from our national contexts. And he also shows that we should think about teaching anew rather than mindlessly claim learning-centered education. This was made clear in his Rediscovery of Teaching 2017 and summarized and elaborated in the recent book World-Centered Education. Indeed, I think that it seems that Professor Biesta's favorite entertainment is to turn things upside down. Nevertheless, but it becomes clear that he rather puts us back on our feet. We can only be looking forward to today's webinar, what we will do with the topic of future imaginaries of the future. Again, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, and floor is yours.
Good, thanks very much. That's already half of my talk summarized, so that's really good. I have a PowerPoint that I will use, and I always put a bit too much text on the PowerPoint, but let's see if that can be helpful. How do I do that? There it is. Yep. So I hope everyone can see that, and I hope the sound will stay stable. And it's really nice to see so many people from, I think, all over the globe. So I'm going to do my best. I'm really honored by the invitation to reflect on the future of education, which is an interesting topic, and particularly to ask what kind of imaginaries are there of the future, what do they do with education, where do they help, and where do they become a problem? Maybe to be very clear from the start, the future of education is not the future of learning. So for me, there is an important distinction there that people who know my work may know that this is an important topic for me. What I'll try to do in this talk is to take you through a number of ideas that have something to do with what the future of education can be if it's not the future of learning. Some of this is more recent, some of this a bit older, but I hope altogether that it does something interesting. There are sort of 5 parts, and I'll signpost those as well, and I'll keep an eye on the clock. So why is the future of education not the future of learning? It has a lot to do for me with what I've called the learnification of education. This idea that everything educational can and should be discussed in terms of learners and learning. This is a global trend, and it's a trend that's still going on. I already wrote about it more than 20 years ago, and I got an email from someone last week who said, I'm going to a big OECD summit in Singapore on the future of education. And then she showed me the program, and the first item on the program was the future of learning. So it's there. For me, this does raise the important question, how can we keep a focus on education? And it's really nice in the audience that are people from many different countries, but also from different languages. And I'm very aware that the word education is actually quite a shallow word in relation to that, whereas countries that have traditions of pedagogy, for example, they have different ways of speaking about it. So please keep your microphone off. Yes, okay, thank you. Now, there is a little device that I want to use in my talk. For people who know philosophy, they may know this razor from William of Ockham. Plurality should not be posited without necessity, which means don't make things more difficult than they need to be. I have a version of this which I would like to call Biesta's razor, and this is just Latin Google Translate. But the point I want to make there, and I will use that halfway in my talk, is to say education only has a point for those things that cannot happen without education. And it may sound a bit circular, but I'll try to show what the idea behind it is. Now, when we talk about the future of education, I see quite a strong image of this future that does something like this. It positions the past and says, in the past we had traditional schools, but we need to move to something else, which is often then referred to in terms of powerful, flexible learning environments. And these are the kind of notions you will find there, where learners are in the center, where learners pursue personalized learning trajectories and learn from real-life situations. You may recognize that. You may even get excited about these ideas. The argument for it is that in those settings, learners can acquire useful knowledge and skills that will allow them to adapt quickly to a rapidly changing world and an unknown future. So for me, this is a cluster of ideas that I see coming back again and again in many policy documents, research, and other ways of talking about the future. In this, teachers are increasingly seen as not very essential. Teachers are called facilitators, for example, and you may have seen these ideas that teachers should no longer be a sage on the stage, but they should be a guide or a peer, or just a learner in learning communities. Now, if you recognize some of this and how we evaluate it is another matter, then you can ask, is this indeed a future we should move towards, a future we should desire? My response to my own question is to say, no, this is precisely not a future we should move towards, because when I take these ideas seriously, I actually think that this is a past that we struggled to get rid of. Now, one way in which I want to make this point and push this point a little is through these words. And I'm always curious, but we can't check that in this setup, how many people know these words and know what they are about. But these are the words that were used to name the roles that children had who worked in the mines. The trappers were the ones who kept the little doors open and closed for water and air circulation. The breakers, for example, or the getters.
We cannot hear you.
His microphone was shut off.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I'm back.
Yeah, it's back.
So these were names for children who worked in the mines. And I'm showing this example because I think it's a perfect example of a very powerful learning environment where these children learned an awful lot. They gained very useful knowledge and skills very quickly. They did so in real life situations. There was no need for teachers and teaching, and they adapted very quickly to the work. So if that is a view about the future of education, I would say it precisely meets a case like this. And then you can say, actually, we are still, and the question is where that sits in different countries in the history of the struggle to get away from this. These are historical examples of the first half of the 19th century in Britain, where finally a lot of work was done in order to change the conditions for children working the mines. And there was new legislation in 1842 that, for example, said that women could no longer be employed underground, that children younger than 10 could not be employed underground, but older children could, and particularly the children of the poor could still continue to work underground. Now, if you look at the whole idea of possible futures of education, then you can begin to see out of this history that actually the school is not a bad place to be. Because compared to these work environments in which a lot was learned very quickly, you can see that the school is actually a place of relief and protection in relation to that. I have the cover of a little book I wrote last year in Dutch, in which I suggested we should actually understand the school precisely as a place of relief and protection, as a sanctuary. This is beautifully captured in something that many people now talk about, but I enjoy reminding everyone of it, that the word school, that in very many languages is used in some form, in original Greek means free time. Now, nowadays we have quite a shallow idea of what free time is, where you can say to be free means to do what you want to do. But if you think of the school as free time, you could say that is the time that is not yet claimed by society. That is the time that is not yet made productive. And you could say that is really important time, the time we as a society give or can give to the new generation. Time in the sense that we set free, and I just try to show very briefly that setting that time free has been important, difficult historical and political struggle. And why is it important to set that time free? You can say in order to give the new generation a fair chance at meeting the world and meeting themselves in relation to the world. And that shows a very particular quality, you can say, of the school that's very different from the idea of flexible learning environments, where you can say that the school is a place for exploration, experimentation, where young people can try, can fail, can try again. And if you know Samuel Beckett, he has this nice sentence where he says, what happens after we try again? We are not suddenly in the moment of perfection, but we can fail better. So there is something about the school that is very different from this flexible learning environment. There is also a question about this idea of useful knowledge, because I hear a lot this idea that we need to change the school so that children and young people gain useful knowledge. And here again, I go back to Britain of the 19th century and wonderful William Lovett, who made a really interesting distinction where he said, yes, there is useful knowledge we need, for example, to do our job or to be a good citizen. That's practical knowledge and skills. And we can pick that up just by being in employment. But Lovett said there is another kind of knowledge that is very unlikely to be picked up when you just work in a factory or mines. He called that very nicely really useful knowledge. Now, what is really useful knowledge for Lovett? It's, for example, knowledge to help you understand who is in power and who fouls, why that is so, why it shouldn't be like that. You can say really useful knowledge is critical knowledge and political understanding. But that kind of knowledge will not automatically come if you are just a worker in factories or mines or those settings. So the point Lovett made here was not just to say there is a different kind of knowledge, but he was also saying in order to make that kind of knowledge available to everyone, we need to work and find the time and the space for doing that. Lovett was one of the initiators of a development called Chartism, which actually was aiming for the educated people, not in terms of useful knowledge, but politically and socially. The document he wrote with John Collins is interesting also because what you can see at the end of the title, it was written from the Warwick prison. So these ideas were seen as so dangerous that people were locked up. So something about the schools, something about useful knowledge and really useful knowledge. And then this third argument that says we need to change education so that young people get the useful knowledge so that they can adapt to rapidly changing environments. Again, I think there is an important critical question to ask there. Is it indeed the case that what is needed for children and young people are the knowledge and skills to adapt to a rapidly changing world and an unknown future? One thing I would say there is that the way in which the world changes, the way in which labor markets change, are not forces of nature, but they come out of very deliberate decisions where some people benefit. You can see that again and again, what happens with employment when it moves from one country to a country with cheaper labor. And suddenly there is unemployment and big questions also focused on education. So to simply say everyone needs the knowledge and skills to adapt to change is, I think, assuming that change just happens and has no interest and no politics. Same with the future. I worry about the suggestion that we are unable to know what the future will look like. At one level, it is correct, but that doesn't mean that the future is just this big black hole. I am happy to claim that questions of sustainability, of democracy, of peaceful coexistence, care, will not suddenly disappear in a week or a year from now. They are part of the human condition. And just to say we do not know what the future will look like makes us very easily forget these big challenges and tasks. And then you can even say with all the emphasis on knowledge and skills needed to adapt, that we can quickly forget the question whether the situations we find ourselves in are actually worthy of adaptation, or whether there is a need to resist. And that exactly is not a matter of knowledge and skills, but it's a matter of judgment. And again, you can say this is political judgment for which you need useful knowledge and the time to come to those judgments. In my work, I often use this example. This is Rosa Parks, who boarded a bus in Lincoln, Alabama in, I think, 1954. And in the bus, there were these signs, white forward, colored rear. And when Rosa Parks was asked to move to the back of the bus, she didn't do that. I use it as an example because if your educational mindset is completely determined by PISA and anxiety about whether children can read or not and whether we can measure all that, it looks like we have an example of educational failure here, because here is someone with a very clear written message, and it looks like she is unable to read the message. And some people who think that reading is a matter of decoding written messages therefore I have to conclude there is something wrong with Rosa Parks' capacity to read. I like the example, you can play with it, because what I think the example shows is, of course, that reading is not a matter of just decoding a message and then obeying to it. What's really interesting about Rosa Parks' example is that she well understood the message, but she was able to judge and make up her own mind and come to the conclusion that at that particular moment she no longer wanted to be part of a society that would always split the colored people from the white people. So you can say it's a nice example of a moment of resistance, but it also shows that reading is not simply a skill, but reading is fundamentally a political act. So what I try to do quickly is to show a very prominent view about what the future of education should be. And I've raised 3 questions about that have to do with how do we understand the school, how do we talk about useful knowledge, and what the issues are around the idea of adaptation or resistance. And for me, that raises really fundamental questions about this particular imaginary of where education should go. It then begins to raise another big question, namely whether in our times, and the R is, I think, an important question, which probably will be answered differently in different countries you're from. But it is the question whether in our times we still have time, you could say, for this particular way of doing school. Here I have been very much inspired by a book from an American author, Paul Roberts, and the book is called The Impulse Society. And in it, Roberts gives an analysis of modern societies where he asks a really important question in the subtitle of the book, the question, what is wrong with getting what we want? And what he shows in the book is that actually there is an awful lot wrong if we base our collective lives, our economic lives, our political lives, our social lives on the logic of just getting what we want and getting it as quickly as possible. You can say society is based on the logic of instant gratification. He spends quite some time looking at how the economy has developed. And one of his insights is that he says we have created economic systems that actually can only grow by constantly telling us that we should desire more. My quick way of saying that is that I would argue that Apple doesn't sell mobile phones, but what they actually sell is the desire for a new mobile phone. That is their business model. And they sell this desire for free. Once this desire has arrived, then very quickly economic transactions follow. And we know that this is not sustainable, but when you look around, this is what is constantly happening in contemporary economies, and also social media are precisely used to constantly multiply desires. It's not just an economic problem, because you can also see it in populist politics, where you could say, what do populist politicians do? They say to voters, if you vote for me, I will give you everything desire. And again, this may sound attractive, but we all know that if we think about it a little, that this is impossible, that it's impossible to give everyone everything they desire. So what Roberts shows in his book is a transformation of society where the principle of just getting what we want has become very strong, and the possibilities and opportunities to raise questions about whether what we desire is what we should be desiring have become more and more reduced, partly because of how economic systems and political populist systems work. But Roberts also shows that institutions that we developed precisely in order to help each other to raise critical questions about our desire, not be immediately consumed by our desires, that even such institutions have become part of the same logic. And those of you who work in higher education may probably recognize the whole rhetoric that says universities should see students as customers and should give them what they want and should not ask students difficult questions. And there you can begin to see that this also begins to erode the whole point of education. So on the basis of analysis, you could actually say these kind of societies need school, need the time of school quite urgent, but not as flexible learning environment, but precisely as places for education, protected places where political questions can be considered. One way to put that is to say, as places for education, they should not be places where just any desire that emerges is accepted, but where work can be done to disconnect from this logic of impulse, this logic of desire. Now, there are all kind of arguments for saying that this is a fundamental educational concern. One scholar again who had inspired me a lot here is Philippe Mérieux, who in his beautiful little book, Pedagogy, le devoir de résister, education, the duty to resist, has this very clear and remarkable sentence where he says, all education is concerned with the difficult work of helping children and young people to disconnect themselves from the logic of desires. So you can say this is a core educational question. And I would even say that in this question, you can find a definition of emancipation, precisely to become free from, say, just being a slave to desires that are thrown in your direction. But the problem, as I indicated, is that capitalist economies and populist politics are precisely not interested in this work of disconnecting, this emancipatory work. So I've said something about the future of education already imaginary and some of the problems. And I asked the question, where does this fit in society? And the idea of the impulse society for me is very helpful. I would even say it's an educational analysis of contemporary society. So what then might that mean for maybe a different future for education? That brings me back to my little razor, where, if you remember, I said education only has a point for those things that cannot happen without education. And I find this an important question because it helps us to try to get into view where education, you could say, is needed. Now, if you can sort of follow what I'm trying to do, you don't have to agree, but if you can follow, then you can probably see what the conclusion here is, that if we want powerful learning environments where people get useful knowledge, to adapt flexibly to rapid changes, I would say we don't need education or we don't need a school for that. For that, you can just get a job, you will get it. There are all kinds of other social configurations that actually also meet that definition. So in a criminal gang, you will also learn an awful lot, which is very useful and allows you to move very rapidly. I also think that if this is what you're after, we can just connect children to personalized online learning algorithms and testing systems, where again you will learn a lot that may be useful, but there are some things that you will not encounter. And that is one of the main points I want to make. So if we look at a razor and say, what are the things that cannot happen without education? Then I would say one important thing that is that in education, unlike learning, you need at least two parties, a student and a teacher. For me, that's a distinctive quality of education. But then even more, it's not just that you have two parties, but that it is important that in education, the presence of the teacher and what teachers do should be essential to what's happening, not accidental. And what I'll try to do in the last step of my presentation is to see, can we identify aspects of education where teachers and teaching are essential rather than accidental. And accidental for me would be this idea of the teacher as a facilitator of what already is going on. Essential has to do with those dimensions that will not happen without teachers or teaching. So this is my exploration. Whether my answer is convincing, that's I would say up for discussion. But for me, it requires, if we try to pursue this line, that we look at education from the angle of the teacher and not to add from the angle of the student or the learner. Now, before I can say a bit more about that, there is another problem, which not only has to do with the fact that in some circles, teaching has gained a bad name, but I think even more that in the whole history of education, there is something with a word I just made up for the fun of it, I would call didactophobia, the fear of teaching. And this fear, in a sense, has a very long history. You can look at Socrates in a particular way, and you can there already see a certain fear of teaching, where Socrates says, I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think. So he's at least a reluctant teacher. Paulo Freire's work is also interesting because he also had concerns about particular, can say, manifestations or positions of the teacher. He has this remarkable claim where he says, education must begin with solving the teacher-student contradiction. And one way for him to solve that is to say everyone should be simultaneously a teacher and a student. So again, there is some reluctance about teaching. Most extreme form, I think, is German anti-Pädagogik, anti-education, which was a movement that not only thought that teachers were problematic figures, but that actually thought that the whole project of education should be abolished. And I found a nice picture of a big poster that said, here education is not allowed. Now, what's the issue here in the fear of teaching? The issue has to do with the idea of teaching as control. Now, I call this an issue because for some people, this is not a problem. Some people think, yes, that is what good teaching should be. It should be a matter of control. We should enhance the effectiveness of what we do so that we can produce measurable learning outcomes or particular identities or useful knowledge. And here you will often also find the arguments that we need to make sure that teachers have authority again. Other people, however, would say that control is precisely what education should not aim for, because educators should be interested in freedom of this, their ability to lead their own life. There you can say education is seen as a matter of emancipation. So you can say the fear of teaching is an understandable response to the idea that teaching should be enacted as control, and there is indeed always a danger that teaching ends up there. But I think it's a response not without problems. And this has something to do with the saying that probably is known in many languages, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because I think that one of the main responses to teaching as control has been to turn to learners and their learning. And that's what I already mentioned at the start, this ongoing learnification of education that you can see in the language, but also in the organization of education. That has also contributed to the gradual disappearance of teachers and teaching. The question for me here is whether it's indeed the case that teaching always ends up as control, but also whether it's the case that learning is a matter of freedom. And I've already shown you in the start of this talk that these children in the mines were learning a lot, but you couldn't say that those were situations of freedom. So I think it remains very important to ask, is there a third option where the whole question of emancipation and freedom is not seen as the absence of teaching, but where we can reconnect teaching with emancipation and freedom. And this is indeed one of the main themes in this book, The Rediscovery of Teaching. I'll come to the final step of my presentation, in which I want to share some reflections on teaching, and we'll try to go to the point where I think we can say here teaching is essential. This cannot happen without teaching. Now, very quickly, we'll all probably see that this also raises questions about what is teaching, or how do we define teaching. There's a lot to say about this. One insight that I have found tremendously helpful again here comes from the work of Klaus Branner, who says if we want to say anything about teaching, a really helpful way in is to look at the form of teaching, the way in which teaching is enacted. And there he makes the claim, and there's a lot of detail in the claim, that teaching is basically a matter of pointing. German, it's zeigen, which has showing and pointing in it. And it's of course interesting that the technology that we use all the time is called PowerPoint. So there is something really interesting in this idea that teaching is a matter of pointing. What is pointing? Again, in a phrase from another German scholar, you can say teaching is the art of redirecting someone's attention. And for that, we need to point, to say to our students, you're paying attention to that, but have you ever considered paying attention to that? You're looking in that direction. Have you ever thought of looking in that direction? You're going there. Have you ever considered going there? Now, already in this very small idea, I think we can find an instance of where the teacher is essential. Because as human beings, we can all direct our attention, but we cannot redirect our own attention. So for our attention to be pulled in a different direction, we need someone else. Prang also says very nicely, each time we point our students to something, to say, have you thought paying attention to this or that? We are also pointing back to them, because in a sense we are inviting them to pay their attention to something. So for me, this is a very helpful way to answer this question, what is teaching, basically. This also shows that teaching is a very weak technology. Teaching can focus attention. Teachers like to demand attention, but teachers cannot enforce or control attention of the student. You can begin to think how far you would go there, but I think at the very end, there is still a moment that you cannot control. So in the act of trying to redirect the student's attention, I think some things are given to students. And I like to talk about that in terms of the gift of teaching. And again, you can say, if we try to look at gifts of teaching, we are trying to highlight things where teaching is essential. I'll do them very quickly, but we can come back to them, or if you're interested, you can read more about it. For me, this is one way to think about curriculum, where I would say curriculum is not about giving students what they ask for, but the important gesture of curriculum is to give students what they didn't ask for. And one important reason for that is that they may not even know that they could have asked. So that's a way to think about curriculum, that is showing that there is something given to students that goes beyond what they could be looking for. I'll probably skip this one, but there's a very interesting discussion to have about didactics and the idea of double truth giving, but we can come back to it if this catches your attention. I also like to suggest that in your attention being redirected to something, you also meet an appeal, a question to yourself, and maybe in that you also encounter yourself in different ways. Again, there's a beautiful German phrase from Dietrich Benner who says, in that appeal, there is an Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, which in English I would say is about knocking on the door of our students and asking whether there is anyone there. So there are, I think, important gifts of teaching that become visible when we see that it's a matter of redirecting someone's attention. And there I would say again that freedom is at the heart of what happens here, because it is not calling students to someone else's attention, but it's calling them to their own attention. Of course, when we invite our students to attend, then the question is, what are we hoping from them? And we have all these technologies that think that we're asked to pay attention. It is because we are supposed to express an opinion or push the like button or do what we want to do with it. I think there is a different way to think about the freedom we encounter there. Maybe the freedom to attend to the world, and also to begin to figure out whether the world may be asking something of you. Here again, you can begin to ask, what would that mean in the practice of education? I take inspiration from Simone Weil, who writes a lot about attention, but then also says attention is, in a sense, the first step. Once something has come to our attention, there is important intellectual work to be done, which needs to be done with a degree of humility. And all of that ultimately comes back to the moment of freedom, moment of judgment or discernment, to work with our students to say, okay, now that this has come to our attention, now that we've engaged with it in sincere manners, where do our lives go from here? In all of that, it's really important to be mindful of the particular form of educational statement, because if we think that education is a matter of dyadic relationships between teachers and students, we immediately end up in the problems I highlighted earlier, because either there the teacher is the authority figure, or if the teacher cannot be in that space, you can say there is a real risk that the teacher says, I have nothing to give, I'm just a facilitator of what is already going on. And here this old idea from didactics, which I think is a much more fundamental educational idea, that education has a triadic structure, is really important, that there is not just a teacher and a student, but that there is always something which very small we can call the task or the theme or the curriculum, but in its biggest gesture we can call that the world. And you can say, if there is any authority in this triadic relationship, it must come from the world, not from the teacher. That's the idea also of world-centered education. So that's what I wanted to share with you as a set of reflections on the future of education. And maybe I want to suggest that rather than talking about the future of education, in the impulse society, there is maybe the more urgent question whether there is still a future for education. A future for education, along the lines in which I've tried to make this case, is a future in which the school has a really important role to play, but not as an instrument to deliver all kinds of things to parties outside of the school, but precisely as an institution, as free time, as protected space. And one way to have an image of that, I often say that's a school that's close to society so that it can be open to the world. But only if you like the language, then it may be meaningful. I also think for that future for education, we need teachers who are not afraid of teaching, who understand that they have something to give, something uniquely to give, but that it's not their gift to control students, but rather to turn the attention to this world. And there with a favorite quote to end it from Bertolt Brecht, who very nicely says, every teacher must not just learn how to start teaching, but also must learn how to stop teaching when the time comes. And he says that's quite a difficult art. And what I like in this sentence is that he then says, only a few are able, when the time is right, to allow reality to take their place. And for me, this is a really important image to see, when does education come to an end? You can say it comes to an end when student says, thank you, teacher, for redirecting my attention. From now on, I am happy to take responsibility for where I direct my own attention. And at that point, you can say teachers should step back and children can walk out of the school into the world. Those were my reflections, and I'm of course very curious what you want to do with that or say in response to it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gert, for this wonderful thought-provoking presentation. Now we can open questions and answers. I will stop recording. You can raise your hand or you can write your questions in chat where Eric Manje will collect your questions. So let me just stop recording